Welcome to the Creative Industry Insight podcast, a podcast that looks at various roles in the creative world. I'm your host, Bobby. Today's guest, Steven Leckart, a co-director on Netflix's docuseries Challenger: The Final Flight, joins us to talk about his work on the project. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode, so make yourself comfortable as we jump into the conversation with Steven. Hi, thanks for joining me today, Steven.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
No, it was again. I know I say this probably with every guest, so the audience are probably sick and tired of listening to it. But I'm always quite excited when I get somebody I don't know on, and that they respond. It's always a win when people respond, but when they agree to come on, it's like, don't mess this up.
Yeah, but most people love talking about themselves and their work. So your hit rate's going to be high all the time.
You'll be surprised how many people blank me, but then again, persistence is key until they block you. But we're here to talk about you, as you mentioned, and we're talking about your new Netflix show, Challenger: The Final Flight, which is a 4-part series on Netflix, which is based on the 1986 Challenger space shuttle disaster. Where I would like to start is, where did the idea for this series come from, and how long did it take for the show to be developed?
How long it took was, I guess, from the moment the first conversation happened till the moment it came out was 4.5, almost 5 years. So a long time. The idea started at the end of 2015. I was having a conversation with Glenn Zipper, who is actually the very first documentary film producer I ever met. He won an Academy Award for Undefeated, which is a high school football movie. It came out about, I think, 8 years ago. And Glenn and I had worked on I think, our 2 movies together that I wrote and he produced. And we were talking about trying to find the next thing to do together because we like working together, and he's smart and just a producer who gives great notes and really smart notes. And suffice to say, I'm really lucky that I met him as the first producer ever in film. And so we were talking about next time out, finding something that was personal to both of us, something that we would instantly sort of feel gravitated towards. Because often it's the case in documentaries, people bring you ideas or subjects or topics, and you maybe don't know that much about it, and you have to learn to figure out what it is that you want to tell about the story, or why it's important to you, or why it's cool, which is a great job to have. And in this case, he said, well, I would think we should start with something where we already have an attachment to it. And I can't remember the first few ideas we threw out, because the second he said Challenger, I just said, I'm in. I was in school at the time, young enough that I didn't understand it, but old enough that I remembered watching the launch. And he's a little older than me, than I am, and had a similar sort of feeling about it. And so that was it. And we just started talking more and more about what it should be, and naively thought we thought it was a movie. And then as we started to uncover and unpack more and more of the story, we realized it needed to be a series because we just needed a bigger canvas.
When I started watching it, because I wasn't born when that happened, I've always sort of known tidbits of the story. And when I started watching the docuseries, I made a conscious effort not to Google anything. I don't know, it just, even though it's real life, I didn't want to be spoiled. Which leads to my next question is, how do you create a docuseries that's about an event that's already happened, that's already known in the zeitgeist? But how do you create something that's going to capture your audience and kind of like get your hooks into them?
It's a great question. I mean, one of the first sort of models of sort of a big epic story that we thought of that is not far off is the movie Titanic, which is, a narrative movie. James Cameron, obviously very different in tone. Leonardo DiCaprio stars in the movie. It's very different. But if you think about the story, it's effectively the hope and promise of this big ship and then the people who go onto the ship, and you spend a long time being romanced by the people on the ship, so that by the time it sinks, which you know is happening because it's inevitable, you really care about the sinking of that ship, and it hurts, whether you like the movie or not. I mean, it was a blockbuster for a reason, and that's why. And so early on, we sort of said to ourselves, well, we know what's going to happen. The question is the how and the why. And rather than sort of have it happen and then go into a postmortem, we figured we would sort of take you on the journey as it was happening, introduce you to characters that you maybe knew or didn't know that well, and just fall in love with them as people and humans and what they represented for, I think, humanity at that point in time. And then meet the characters who were sort of in the shadows and privately feeling that something wasn't right. And then, of course, when the tragedy happens, our story doesn't end there. And that's the slight difference with Titanic. That's where a lot of stuff happens after the fact, and we start to figure out how and why the truth comes out. Because by that point, we knew what caused the accident in the story. So, that was sort of our approach. But how you take a story that's all told and is historical, I mean, that's documentary filmmaking, unless it's a verite doc about something that's present day. So I've made a lot of documentaries that are historical. In fact, I think all of them, to most of them, have been all historical. I made a movie about Muhammad Ali that I wrote, that's on HBO and Sky in the UK, and it's entirely archival and is all set in the past. And I did do a series about Bill Gates that I wrote and produced for Netflix, which had some stuff that was present day, but most of it was in the past. So figuring out how to architect something that's already happened is in real life is actually, to me, not that complicated, because you kind of, it's all there. You just put it all on the table and figure out what part's relevant.
Leading on to what you're saying as well, that you've got parts on the table and what's relevant. How do you decide what's relevant and what's important to your story? Because as well, you mentioned about writing documentaries. I guess in my mind, I always thought you don't really write a documentary. You kind of just plan everything out. So what do you mean as well by writing a documentary?
Yeah. So traditionally, documentaries were made by directors and editors and producers. There were no writers. I mean, there were writing credits, but the writer was usually either the editor or the director or some combination. And a lot of documentaries are made in the edit, which means that the editor is writing and pulling pieces and starting to structure things out. And then around, I guess sometime in the last 15 years, there's a producer in Los Angeles named Mark Monroe who became quite famous for being a dedicated writer on documentaries. And I didn't know any of this because I don't come from film, and I didn't aspire to film. I fell into it by accident. But as I mentioned before, there was a producer, the first producer I ever met knew about and had worked, I believe, with that doc writer, and sort of presented it to me as an option, given my background as a magazine journalist, that he thought I might be a good fit for that kind of role. And what that role is depends on the project. But if you basically get brought a subject or a topic or an idea as a writer, my job is to put pen to page and figure out what are the relevant bits, what is the structure, and work with the director. If I'm writing for a director, what are the questions the director wants to answer? What's the vision the director has? How does she or he feel about the story? And then also give that person my input about how I think would be the best telling of it. And so then we start to collaborate, and I put pen to page and usually write like a treatment. Now, it's not a script in the same way you would have a movie, but it's a treatment. So it's anywhere from a page to could be 20 pages sometimes. And it outlines the story, and it's written narratively and almost like you would read a magazine article. And I do that because that's just my background. I'm not sure if that's how other people would approach it, but it tends to work. So then you can hand that off to an editor And the editor can say, well, now I understand the story. And then the writer's job usually is to continue working with the editor or editors to start taking that piece of paper, that treatment, and then just break it up and to distill it into note cards on the wall. So all film and TV tends to be done with note cards on a wall. Different color could represent different story threads or characters or beats and moments. And then you use those cards to sort of walk yourself through how to piece the thing together. And so from that point on, writing a documentary becomes a collaborative effort with the editor and the director. And you just sort of keep working the cut, refining the cut. And to your earlier question, what's relevant, sometimes the things that you are so in love with that are so special to you that you think have to be in there. Well, when you see it laid out in the cut, you can do what's called a straight lift, where if you just pull that little 2-minute sequence out and the cut plays fine, sometimes it's better because it just keeps you flowing and it keeps it moving. And sometimes you realize the things that you cared about that you thought were so important are actually speed bumps. So I like to say that although on the front end, I have a good sense of what I think is relevant and what I think is great and what will work, I'm the first to admit sometimes when you see it in the edit, it just doesn't work. And I think the best collaborative filmmakers are the ones that divorce themselves from their assumptions, because once the cut starts to take on a life of its own, you can't necessarily force it back to where you were or just put it in because, well, I'm right. I was right. It was my idea and I don't want to be wrong. But that's just my own philosophy. Some people are convinced that their ideas must be, it's their way or the highway. And that's good for them. That's how they want to live.
There's so much I sort of still want to unpack from your answer. And I guess I do have a couple of questions, but I think the first pressing one that I am curious about is, how do you go about directing a documentary? Because I guess with a TV show or movie, you're there on a set, you have a certain amount of pages that you need to get through a day, you have this scene that you need to do, you've got this set up. But with a documentary, especially something like Challenger, where it's a mixture of archival footage and interviews, is it more of a case of just a lot of it is in the prep, in knowing the story beats and then basically having those interviews fall together? Or is it more of a case of, I don't know, maybe something else?
Yeah, I mean, it's column A, column B. My co-director and I arrived at 4 episodes early on, and we knew what the big set pieces were across all 4 episodes. When we pitched it to Netflix, we knew we were opening on the day of the launch. We knew that after we hit the main title, we wanted to back up to the first landing. We knew where all those beats would fall. We knew when we wanted to back up in time and then advance forward, and that the January 28, 1986 launch would happen at the end of episode 3 and pick back up at the top of 4. So when you put those set pieces out there, then you're just sort of trying to get from point A to point Z in a way that, sharpens the narrative as best as possible, hopefully builds tension, also carries you from one episode to the next. And then you're sort of figuring out where and how best to foreshadow. Now that's before you shoot any interviews and figure out who all the voices are going to be. We knew some of the people that we were going to interview from day one. And then there were people that we had to go searching for and figure out who was still alive. Since you watch the film, we didn't interview any experts. We didn't interview any authors who wrote books. We didn't interview any academics who studied the subject. We didn't interview anybody who didn't live the story personally. So when we set that sort of rubric for ourselves, it meant that we had to find people who could tell us different facets of the story. And we knew at that point that when you go out to cast for those people and have conversations with people and make phone calls, those phone calls are often, I don't like to call it a pre-interview, but you're getting a feel for who is that person and what perspective might they share. And then you start to figure out, okay, well, in the harmony of voices, do we have enough of that? Do we need more of this? Is this person going to give us that? And that's before we even get to the interview. And then once we're in the interview, we have a sense of the full arc of what we want to discuss. But, along the way in the conversation, when you stir the pot of somebody's memory, you can find yourself into a cul-de-sac where they share something with you that you either didn't know or something that you didn't expect. And a good example of that is June Scobie Rogers, who was the wife of pilot Dick Scobie, or Commander Dick Scobie, I should say. He was a pilot first, and then he was the commander of Challenger. In our interview, I had read her book ahead of time, and I knew the story about the Valentine's card, but I didn't ask her about the Valentine's card. When we were talking and interviewing her, it just came out of her. She told that story just as it is. You see it in the film. So it's a good example of something where I didn't have a card on the wall that said Valentine's card, because I didn't know if we could count on getting that from her in a way that was beautiful. And I didn't try to force it. It just came out of her. And I think it was so special. Then we went in the edit and found a place for it. So it's a little bit of a mixture of planning, but also leaving open the possibility of something organic. And then at that point, you need to then reconfigure the edit to make it gel and make it work. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but it's a mixture of stuff, because I don't think you can go into an interview without some prep, just like you were telling me you prepped for your interviews, right? It's not too dissimilar. As far as the archival is concerned, it's the same thing. So there's a clip at the top of the 4th episode that is like a handy camcorder footage shot clearly in someone's front yard, and you can hear them talking off camera. And it's haunting because you can see the launch happening from far away, and their VO says everything. The guy says, looks like there it is over the trees, it looks like trouble. That looks like some trouble. And that was a clip that I found probably 3 years before we even started editing the movie. I just was online and digging deep and doing research and found that clip and was blown away. And so that was something we earmarked very early on to want to use and figure out where can it go. And then there's other things that get brought in, and I didn't see it until the editors found it, and then they draped it into the cut because they thought it was great. And so all a long way of saying that docs are, made in fits and starts, and you just require a lot of attention, not from any one person, but a nice team that is dedicated to putting in the time and the energy. And if our team didn't put in the time and energy on the back end, there'd be a lot of stuff that was missed. So I'm just grateful that, they put in the time and the energy to make sure that it was good.
The Valentine's Day card absolutely killed me. Just that story and everything. It was just, and I guess that's what makes documentaries good, because it's more than the subject at hand. And with yours, even though it's about a spaceship, it also has that sort of human element to it. And that's really well weaved in to the story, that you have, I guess each episode feels like, for me, you'll have the sort of science and prep of the spaceship, but then on the side, it feels like vignettes of 10 minutes of the spaceship stuff, and then it goes to the astronauts, and then back to the spaceship stuff, and then it also builds up the tension for the inevitable on episode 3. Even though you see what happens in the first 5 minutes, which I thought was quite, rewatching it this evening, I thought was quite ballsy that you started it off like that you start off with the launch and everything. But then also I noticed again is just how well you introduce each astronaut and what they did, their specialties and who they are and what they did, which is cool. Also, I noticed, because I was going back to sort of human element, in episode 4, you sort of pivot the way the camera captures interviews after the explosion. So instead of being sort of to the side profile, it is basically they're talking down the lens. Was that something that you kind of had consciously that you wanted to do, or was that something that kind of happened on the day once you sort of saw people emoting, reliving that sort of moment?
It's a great question. And I will say it's very gratifying that you picked up on it. So that was an idea that we had before we ever pitched it to Netflix. I was having coffee with my co-director, And I said, listen, I have this weird idea, because we hadn't really discussed how we wanted to shoot it. And I said, I want to shoot 3 cameras. And down the barrel, down the lens, so to speak, is something that popularized by Errol Morris many years ago and is now used, to great effect and sometimes to not great effect in a lot of documentaries. The Firefest documentary, which came out on Netflix, is a good example. All those interviews are down the barrel, and they're beautifully shot, and it's very effective because you're connecting, right? You're talking, that looks like the person's talking right to you. And so I remember telling Daniel, my co-director, I'd like to shoot all our interviews with 3 cameras, 2 standard, 1 wide, 1 B cam, and then I want to shoot down the barrel. And I said, I think if we can do it, what would be incredible would be after the explosion, if the people that you've spent all this time with through the course of 2.5 episodes are suddenly ratcheted to camera, it could be very arresting and feel, a filmmaker would pick up on it, but the average viewer might not, and they might not know why it is suddenly becoming so personal that they're looking right at you. And he said, I've never seen anything where somebody's done that before, but I think we should try for it. And then his addition was, well, if we're going to do that and only use one of the angles sparingly for the last, basically the last episode, why don't we add a 4th camera? And I said, well, I've never even shot 3 cameras, so we might as well shoot 4. And that's how it came about. And it worked. I was very satisfied that I think it worked. And I don't think I would do it in another project. I think this one made sense for that, to just suddenly have a perspective shift like that around this huge tragedy that everybody, witnessed. I mean, because we all witnessed it. So I think it worked.
Maybe it was just in my mind subconsciously, it just clicked watching it on a big screen and then just seeing it being filled by someone and just seeing, some the tears come down, and just how all these years later it still resonates with these people who experienced it. And I don't know why it just, I guess it hit me in the face with it, but it didn't take me out of it, which was great. Whilst because you mentioned as well beforehand, I'm just going slightly back when you're talking about prepping for the interviews, that beforehand you would have a pre-interview with someone, sort of just getting their an understanding of who they are. What was there ever a moment where you were doing the sort of pre-interview where you felt unsure with someone, but then once you sat down and they told you that, you gave them questions, you were swayed by them?
I'm not sure. I mean, and I should clarify too, I don't go deep when I'm having those first conversations. And actually those first conversations are mostly intended to make that person comfortable with us to want to do it. I mean, those conversations, there were many people that started the conversation by saying, I don't think I want to do this and I'm not interested, but I'll talk to you. And we had a pretty good conversion rate of convincing people why our vision for the series was different from everything else that had been made and why it was worth their time to participate. So that in the course of those conversations, they would reveal pieces of their personality. And also I get a chance to hear how they sound and how they think about it. But I'm not asking a lot of specific questions in detail. It's more so just getting a read on them as people, and also hearing what their concerns might be, or how they respond to different pieces of what we're putting out there. A lot of people felt, I think, surprised, but also very pleased to hear that we wanted to make such a big deal about the class of 78 and how, that class that came in 1978 of astronauts, how special it was that it was the first women and the first people of color and the first people of multiple religions to all be training to be astronauts. No one had really made that connection in any real movie or documentary before and connected it to the Challenger legacy. And so I think a lot of people were sort of surprised to hear that. And so then a lot of things would come out. People would start sharing memories of class of 78, for instance, or what their training was like. And then that put it in my head, okay, I think this person will be great. Ray Seddon is a good example. She's a medical doctor, trained as a medical doctor, and was working as a medical doctor and physician, I believe, when she applied to be an astronaut. And I remember getting on the phone with her and just being so charmed by her and her personality. And, she made a comment about being one of the smallest astronauts in history in terms of her height. And I remember saying, okay, I think she's going to be really fun and really delightful. And she was. She was a great interview. There was nobody that disappointed me as far as their interviews were concerned. We shot, I think, 26 or 27 interviews all totaled, which is quite a lot of days. But we had to be very careful. We could have interviewed 10 times that many people, but you get into budgetary restrictions, and then, you can't just shoot and figure it out later. So we had to try to be pretty targeted. And I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I do think that everyone we interviewed, there was only one interview we shot that didn't make the film. And that was for reasons that it was a great interview. The person's great. It just was a story thread that we couldn't find a way to work into the film.
Oh, poor person. That one guy, one woman who just didn't make the cut. There's always has to be one, I guess.
I called him ahead of time and gave him a heads up, and let him know, that it wasn't for a lack of trying. And I think he ultimately understood, and he's a storyteller as well. He's a journalist, and he said he's had to make the same phone calls to people. So of all the people who unfortunately couldn't make the cut, I think he understood by virtue of his own experience.
Imagine if you didn't tell him and then he sat down. It's like, guys, he's got his whole family with him. Everybody's doing a Netflix watch party. And it's just like four episodes out there. And it's like, so when's your part coming?
Yeah, I wouldn't. I don't like that kind of stuff. So I was never going to let that happen. And before it came out, I made a lot of phone calls to give people a heads up of what to expect. And we also allowed the family members of the crew to see the series ahead of time. We felt it was important that they see it before the public, so that they could get ahead of anything. And we also wanted their feedback, and I was very pleased that overwhelmingly positive feedback is what we received from them. So that was, once I had the family's feedback, once we had that, I think for me personally, I was less concerned or nervous about the reviews or what the viewership would be like. I just felt like if the people who participated felt like we got the story right and felt that we honored their loved ones in a way that felt special and felt real and tangible and all those good things, then it felt like, okay, I could pat myself on the back or at least give myself a break. So by the time it came out, I'd already kind of had a big sigh of relief.
Good as well that when people give you positive feedback, especially if it's about their loved ones and a tragedy and everything. But I'm curious to know as well, you did ask some really hard questions to people, and especially those involved on the NASA side. When asking those sort of questions, how do you go about structuring them so you're biased? So if you have a biased point of view on the subject of what happened, how do you go about constructing those questions that your bias isn't sort of shown?
It's a great question. And I think you start by trying to divorce yourself from any bias you might have. In this case, I wasn't going in to interview somebody that had been convicted of a crime, right? These were men who were doing their job and made decisions that in retrospect seemed faulty. So it just getting into their heads and how they were thinking about everything as time was marching on, to me, it wasn't that complicated. If I was interviewing somebody that had been convicted of murdering their entire family and that conviction was standing and they weren't, they committed, they said, I'm guilty, right? Then the line of questioning might be different, right? But even then, to be honest with you, I just sort of think people are people, and I want to hear what their thought process is. So I don't ever really go into any interview with any kind of sense of there's gotcha. I'm not trying to finger point. I just don't, that's just not my style of how I do it. And I don't write questions out ahead of time. I just go and talk to people and have conversations with people. And I said before, I got into filmmaking by accident. I started as a journalist, and as a journalist, over years and years and years of doing this, I just started to find what worked best for me, which is just to be myself and to come in and be who I am, which is a sincerely curious person. So asking tough questions, you build up to it. You don't come right out of the gate with those tough questions. So you do have to make sure that you build some trust before you do it. But there's no manipulation and there's no trickery in it. It's just asking another person how they felt about something and when something happened, and just asking them beat by beat to tell me what happened. How did you feel about that? Why did you do that? Why didn't you do that? These are they're really simple questions. I think people are afraid to sometimes just ask the simple things.
Was there ever a moment where when you're pulling on a thread and then you're surprised by the answer that you're given?
Absolutely. Every time. There's moments where you can see somebody, I think, even surprise themselves, and that it just comes out of them and they say something that they didn't intend to say, or it's how they say it. And I'm real careful not to step on them and to try to just give them the space and the time to say whatever they're feeling or saying. And I'll stick on a subject for a while and just keep following it up with more and more if I think there's a there. But yeah, on this project and every project, there's always surprises. I think that's the best part of documentary filmmaking, is that it is organic. And even if it's a historical documentary and you're going to sit with people and hear their memories of the past, there's always bits and pieces that are you didn't know. And I like that aspect about it. And it's why I feel like I'll just do this forever, because of the surprises.
So there's always those sort of little gems that people come up with when you're talking to them, and as well as if you make people feel comfortable, as you obviously know. It's just once you get somebody talking, it's like a stream. They just don't stop. And I guess what I liked about this sort of about Challenger, as well as you said, is like there was no finger pointing. It was getting into the mindset of, I guess, human nature as well, and thinking what's best and what's right, especially when NASA is funded by the government. They have to hit certain targets. And I think somebody says it best as well. What was his name? I had it here. Lawrence, I think, is it Lawrence Malloy? Who, I think you asked, would you do it again differently? And he said no.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that was Malloy or a different person, but either was a NASA official who was asked. He said, if I had the same information in front of me, I would have done it exactly the same. And that's a complex situation, but you realize that no one wanted anyone to die, right? Nobody wanted bad things to happen to good people. And despite the fact there's mistakes are being made, and I think NASA got into a bit of a pattern of, to a degree, complacency. A lot of stuff kind of, over time, you got people who were okay with risk. They accepted risk, and then they accepted more risk. And then, well, we flew last time and there was no problem, so we keep flying. Well, that problem is still there, but we're seeing the problem, but it hasn't caused a problem, if that makes sense. And so things just continue to snowball. So I can kind of understand that. Well, if you had to do it over again, maybe yes, the answer you'd want to hear is I would have stopped everything. But at the same time, I can kind of understand somebody who says, well, we all made the decision together that we would keep doing this, and we were fine with it. So I was surprised by that answer, but only in retrospect do I kind of understand what he meant by that, if that makes sense.
It's always a really hard one, because, as you said, the intention wasn't to have people die, it was intention to sort of expand on space travel and start getting, for lack of a better term, ordinary people up there.
Yeah. Well, and it's also, I sort of liken it to, well, I mean, there's a bit of, we're seeing a lot, I mean, not a bit of it, we're seeing it in America today in terms of who takes responsibility for what, as far as the pandemic is concerned. And well, who is at fault? And there's finger pointing and blame. And, you realize that these situations, there's not one person who's at fault for anything. There's a lot of hands involved, and it's complex. So we really tried not to say, well, this is the one person who is at fault in this scenario. So even though somebody says they would still make the same decision, somebody else said, I wish I had done things differently. Tragedy is a litmus test of character, and it's a litmus test of who you are as a person. And some people also want to live with themselves and will tell themselves whatever they need to hear in order to live, the rest of their lives. So I like to say I'm not there to judge. I'm just sort of there to ask questions and then to hear what people think and say. And maybe that's different from other filmmakers. I don't know. I don't do issue documentaries. I don't take on topics to sort of lambast or skewer people who are, polluting the environment. That's just not the kind of filmmaking I do. I'm much more interested to sit down with human beings and let them reveal themselves to the camera and then figure out how does this all gel together in terms of telling a story, rather than, okay, I'm here to now ask you these tough questions about why you're polluting this river. It's just not the kind of filmmaking I do.
Does lead on as well to story again, but more when you're in the editing process. I know you mentioned a lot earlier on as well about it, but then is there anything that changed in the edit, the story wise, other than having that one person cut?
Oh yeah, no, the first episode was the episode that took absolutely the longest to figure out how to do, because there's history, there's context, there's technology and science, there's so much. There's even the day of the launch, right? We, as you said, we open on the day of the launch and we spend a pretty significant amount of time in that day. At one point we had a much shorter moment, and then we extended it because we felt that it was necessary to really build up the day and to live in it longer. And the longer you lived in it, it pulled you in. So there were a lot of things that made the cutting room floor. There's a famous bar that burned down in Houston, which were all the astronauts dating back to, I think, the original astronauts in America used to go and drink. But it wasn't just astronauts, it was secretaries and administrators and engineers, and it was sort of like the Cheers for Houston. And we shot an actual recreation of a drink called the Flaming Hooker that they used to drink. It was an old pilot drink, and it's this, I think it's a cup of brandy, a shot of brandy, and you light it on fire, and then you have to shoot the glass. You take the shot, and then if you put the glass back down and it's still flaming, that's a success. And of course, if you do it incorrectly, your whole face can burn. You could burn your mustache if you have facial hair. And we had a whole sequence built with music and a recreation shot with this beautiful tracking shot that took forever to architect well. And we had astronauts talking about the bar, and we were watching the cut, and it, like I said before, it's a straight lift. We lifted it out and the cut was better, and it just went away, and there are pieces like that for every episode. So divorcing yourself from something that just feels like interesting or fun or off color or is just wallpaper in the end is hard to do, but is necessary. And I don't think there's anything that we cut from the film that was a mistake.
You mentioned as well recreations, and there's a number of them as well at the beginning when they wheel the TV into the school, into the classroom, when they're having the meeting with NASA and everything. Were recreations important to you when you're creating the story, or was it just something that you wanted to add on to sort of create more tension in the story?
Yeah, that's a great question. Recreations were from day one part of the vision, and we knew we knew that the night before the launch was effectively the heart of the movie. And I don't mean the heart of the movie, because the heart of the movie is the characters, especially the family members. It's stories like the Valentine's card. That's the heart of the movie, is the human cost. But when I mean the heart of the movie, I mean the middle, the sort of midpoint in the film where all the tension has been building up to this moment and this scene. We knew we were going to live in that scene quite a bit. And we knew that that scene, which is the night before the launch, when there's the argument going back and forth from different sides of should we launch, should we not? What's your data? What does the data show? Well, if it's cold, well, how cold? And we knew all that tension was going to be a really big part of this episode leading up to the launch. So if you think about working backwards from there, well, how do you visually show that? There was no cameras in the rooms at the time. There was no photographs of those rooms. It was 1986. So what would be the best way to visually represent that? And we knew that recreation done well, where you don't see people, shallow depth of field. We knew if we treated it correctly and shot it in such a way, we'd have a lot of ability to cover and to really show the tension and build tension. And so knowing that, when we pitched it to Netflix, we made sure recreations were a clear part of the vision. And from there, we also understood that recreations could not only live in one small piece of the film, but they needed to be part of the whole sort of look and feel of the story. And so we came up with a series of other sequences that would sort of be scattered through the movie, or not scattered, I should say, but placed in very strategic spots throughout the film, so that we introduce that language. So by the time you get to the night before the launch in the third episode, it doesn't feel visually jarring. And the TV was a really simple one at the beginning, because that's the memory that if you were of a certain age, you were one of those kids in that classroom. I was a kid in the classroom. I remember the TV getting wheeled in. It always was up here. You're always looking up at the TV. It's the big boxy thing. And so we kind of felt that if we could start the whole film with a bit of a nod to that memory and have it be this something that we could control like a good recreation, it would also just feel really cinematic, and then it would feel very personal. So if you didn't have that personal connection to it, then it would at least feel cinematic. And if it could do both, then, that's the best situation.
It's interesting to hear the train of thought for recreations, but then also something so simple as like a phone call, basically a conference call between two sets of people, can put you on edge, especially in that third episode where you're sitting there and maybe for me, you're kind of screaming at the TV being like, cancel, and then they're still kind of going ahead with it. I don't know, it just evoked quite a lot of emotion for me. One of the final couple of questions I have, and this is kind of stepping way back, because you're mentioning about pitching to Netflix. What was the pitching process like, and how far along were you in shooting, or was there already a proof of concept provided to them?
Great questions. So we had shot a few days in Utah in 2016 and captured a couple of interviews, one of which is Leslie Cerna, Bob Ebling's daughter, who you see in the film. However, what we captured in 2016, we didn't wind up using in the series, because by the time 2019 rolled around and we were fully greenlit and going to shoot, we had access to significantly better cameras and lenses, and we had a whole, we wanted to shoot the 4-camera approach, whereas when we shot those first interview, we did do to camera, but we only had 2 cameras. So we sort of knew we had to rethink shooting. For the pitch itself, we had a deck that was written out and took you through the entirety of the story. And we included bits and pieces of archival to give a sense of the world that we were going to build and just how deep some of the archive went and what we had found. And then it was a verbal pitch. So the deck was sent out ahead of time and we went in and we pitched 3 places. Netflix was the first place we went. And to be honest, at that point, I'd never had such an immediate, sort of palpable, positive reaction on any pitch that I'd been a part of, where we walked in and started the conversation. They had clearly read the materials. They thought that the team that had been assembled was going to achieve this vision and deliver on it. And we left there pretty confident that we would wind up at Netflix. And I'm just grateful that we did. They were very supportive from day one, and throughout the entire process, the notes they give are smart and good. And, everything on the back end has been fantastic. All the artwork that they created, the key art is beautiful. The press team and marketing teams worked incredibly hard to kind of make people aware of the film. So it's just a great partnership.
And what's been the biggest surprise to people's reaction to the show, especially when it's on something like Netflix that has like a crazy reach around the globe?
Yeah, the best sort of reaction that I've been noticing is how much people are connecting the story of the Challenger to what we're seeing with the pandemic, especially in the United States. And this outright denial of science and data, and allowing that politics to sort of, trump science. That people making that connection, when we were making this film, it was long before the pandemic existed. But to see people starting to make that connection, I thought was really quite fascinating. And I think it's a testament to the fact that, systemic dysfunction in bureaucratic environments will continue to happen. So Chernobyl is something we talked quite a lot about, because we'd already been started making Challenger, and then Chernobyl came out, the HBO series, which I watched and I thought was incredibly well done, and definitely influenced to a degree how we started to think about our own film. And the 2 stories are rather similar. And Chernobyl has nothing to do with America. If you think about it, it's about, a completely different subject, but it is about a big system that is in denial of the truth. And what happens when we deny the truth and everything starts to erode on the inside, and that dysfunction sort of spirals out of control. And in the case of Challenger, 7 Americans died, and people witnessed it. And in the case of Chernobyl, many more people died and then were poisoned and were sick. And then in the case of the pandemic, now over 260,000, I'm not sure, in America have died. So there's a through line through all that, and it has to do with, not being able to manage these big bureaucratic systems, and that at the end of the day, people are people and are fallible and mistakes are made. But if you can slow down and listen to reason, you can skirt tragedy. And I think that's a big takeaway that I think a lot of people have, at least based on what I'm seeing on social media, people are making those connections, and I'm really proud of that.
And my final question, which is going to be a nice easy one, is what's next for you?
Well, that's a good question. I'm attached to a handful of projects, most of which are not announced, but there's one that I am attached to that has been announced. So I'm writing and producing a feature documentary that'll be on HBO next year in 2021. That's called The Day Sports Stood Still. And it's effectively the story of sports around the world during the time of COVID. So, in March of 2020, when all sports shut down over the course of, I think, a 2-day period or a 36-hour period, we track all the fallout from that and the journey back to playing and sports picking back up, especially here in America. And so I think it's a testament to the era that we're living in, because the bulk of the interviews are shot through Zoom. It's a lot of archival footage, but it's been pretty remarkable to get into the headspace of these elite athletes and how their lives have been completely derailed by this, just as it's probably derailed your life. And I know it's derailed my life as well. So that's the next project I can talk about.
Oh, that sounds cool. Sports does play a big part in my life. Absolutely adore football, or as you guys call it, soccer. I can't believe I just said that, but it sounds like an interesting project because sports does connect so many people in the world, and so many discussions on the internet. And then also, it's a lot of people's hobbies to go to live sports and to be there. And I know that I'm miss going to games, and I think the last game I went to, my team won 5-0. So it's like a bittersweet memory, but it's also just like, I wish that wasn't the last time that I had gone.
It's an emotional thing. Sports is not an individual situation. You're part of a thing. So whether you're watching at home or whether you're there in person, it is this collective experience. And it doesn't matter what your politics are, doesn't matter what age you are, what religion, what gender, all of that. When you're a fan, you're a fan. And how does that feel to be a part of something bigger than yourself? But how does it feel when that gets taken away from you right at the height of this moment in time where we're all sort of being forced to stay at home and we can't do really almost anything that we're used to? And so I leapt at the opportunity to try to work on something in this period of time that actually felt very connected to today. So that's actually one of the first projects I've done where it's very today and of the moment, and we're sort of tracking stuff as they go. And we cover June of 2020, when for the first time in history, there were protests in all 50 American states off the back of the George Floyd situation here in America. And so to be able to capture something that is very of the moment as a filmmaker was great, especially coming out of something that was so historical. So I guess in general, as a storyteller, I just want to always be probing things that are new and different and interesting to me, and hopefully, turn into things that inspire other people and connect with them. So you can watch it next year and tell me what you think.
Maybe I'll get you back on to talk about it. There's something that you said I do want to ask one. I know I said the last one was the last question, but there's something I just want to follow up on what you said just now. Are you a little bit worried, though, making a documentary about the pandemic for people to watch, that they'll have to sort of be deterred by it because it's something that's so recent?
No, I'm not concerned.
Okay, I'll take that.
No,
I like that. Nice and short and sweet.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was concerned that people wouldn't want to watch a 4-part documentary about a tragedy during the middle of a tragedy. And, that concern was met with millions of people all over the world watching it. So I think the reality is that some people like to palate cleanse with things that are pleasant and mindless, and I'm one of them. And then some people also like to go into, things that are tougher and darker. And I also think since you watch Challenger, for a story that is ostensibly about a tragedy, we imbued it with a lot of light and a lot of hope. And we don't end in 86, we end in 88 with, spoiler alert, but the return to flight and how hopeful that was. And we start the first episode with so much hope and optimism. And I still think that hope and optimism is valid and should be held on to. So, despite the fact we're making a doc about, COVID and sports, there's a lot of hope and a lot of optimism and a lot of light in that story as well. And so hopefully people will tune in and watch, and we can talk about it next year and see.
I'll be hot on your case to get you back on to talk about it. And that'll be good. Steven, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been really fun, and I'm really glad that I got to ask the questions that I wanted and got such a really good insight into all of it. Thank you again.
Thank you. Stay safe and be well.
You too. Take care. And again, thank you very much. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.